Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 12th Annual Archives Lecture. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. My name's Maggie Shapley and I'm the University Archivist here at the ANU. This event is sponsored by the ANU Archives and the Friends of the Noel Butlin Archives Centre. The exciting news for the archives this year is that our database is now online and is searchable by your favourite search engine, so please check us out. If you want to know more about the archives, please take one of our leaflets that's in the foyer. You might also want to, for a modest subscription, I think it might be $20, join the Friends of the Noel Butlin Archives Centre. The Friends manage a conservation fund which helps the archives digitise and conserve valuable material. So you might also want to contribute to that tax-deductible fund. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Professor Jeannette Bastian. Jeannette directs the Archival Education program at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at Simmons College in Boston. She was also Territorial Librarian at the United States Virgin Islands from 1987 to 1998 and has published widely on collective memory, post-colonialism and archives education. Jeannette's visit to Canberra has been sponsored by the ANU Humanities Research Centre for the Shaping Canberra conference last week and for the Building an Archival Memory of Canberra workshop held yesterday. So some of us have already had the pleasure of hearing her speak. Tonight she speaks to us on the topic, Whose Memories, Whose Records? When the archival legacy of a colonial past meets the cultural records of a post-colonial future. So please join me in welcoming her.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'd really like to thank Maggie Shapley and Michael Piggott of the Noel Butlin Archives and the Friends of the Noel Butlin Archives for inviting me here, as well as the Humanities Research Centre, who has helped to sponsor my visit. So today, as you can see, my subject is Whose Memories, Whose Records? When the archival legacy of a colonial past meets the cultural records of a post-colonial future. The opening sentences of the Declaration of the American Declaration of Independence are familiar to most Americans. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Few, however, may be familiar with the next section of the Declaration that lists a long list of grievances against the British King, George V. And still fewer might be aware of grievance number 4, one of particular interest to archivists, which reads, "He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures." The separation of the colonists from their records was soon rectified. Shortly following the American Revolution in 1776, historical societies and state archives initiated a series of copying projects, sending people to England, France, and Germany to copy all records relating to the American colonies and its people. These copying projects continued well into the late 19th century, similar to copying projects of several other former colonies, notably Canada and Australia. The Australian National Library had joint copying projects with repositories in the UK through the mid-20th century. For the Americans, history ironically reversed itself 100 years after the end of the Revolution, when the United States acquired colonies and territories of its own. The United States government stored the records created in these territories in the U.S. National Archives, claiming them as federal records. These colonies and territories included islands in the Pacific, Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Marianas, and islands in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. Guam and Puerto Rico are now commonwealths, while the other three are unincorporated territories of the United States. Unfortunately, few of these territories have had the resources to initiate copying projects of their own. It's easy to forget that America, like Australia, was once a colony, suffering from some of the same custodial records issues that we generally associate with smaller, more vulnerable entities. But my concern today is not so much with the record grievances of large land masses, but rather of small islands, those relatively diminutive bodies of land, whether in the Pacific Ocean or the Caribbean Sea, that have at some point in their history been colonized, and which, to a larger or lesser extent, still suffer from the effects. Post-colonial is generally the political term applied to these entities, but the term itself has fallen into disfavor, since it assumes the negative implication that former colonial entities continue to be appendages to colonial relationships. In the case of the archives, however, this may unfortunately still be true. When Maggie and the Friends of the Noel Butlin Archives Center invited me to deliver the annual lecture, they suggested that I might like to reflect on some of the archival issues around ANU's collection of records from and about the Pacific Islands, such as issues as documentation, custody, repatriation, access. I claim no expertise and very little knowledge about the Pacific Islands, but I do have some knowledge of former colonial islands in the Caribbean, having lived and worked on one island trio, the United States Virgin Islands, as a librarian and an archivist for the largest part of my professional career. Despite the thousands of miles between the Pacific and the Caribbean, all these former colonized and still not quite independent territories share many characteristics. Many of these common characteristics also create similar records issues. So some common characteristics: climate. Both sets of islands are tropical, constantly threatened by extreme weather, hurricanes in the Caribbean, typhoons and cyclones in the Pacific. Geography. These are island groups distant from the mainland. Colonized populations, indigenous communities in the Pacific, descendants and of African slaves in the Caribbean. Cultural. Both sets of islands have strong, dynamic oral traditions and similar political status, former colonial, now primarily self-governing, and language. Not the same languages, but wide varieties of languages, including indigenous languages, as well as those of the colonizers. So some common records issues: custody, an ambiguous ownership of colonial records; repatriation, questions of returning records to islands where they were created, questions of sharing records; oral traditions, how do you document them, how do you preserve them; ethics, whose records are these and who should use them; heritage and collective memory, what is it, how is it manifest in these very different cultures. The common issues also beg two larger inclusive global questions. The first, why do countries and their peoples, no matter their size, need their archival records? And two, what are the archival records? Possession of historical records may seem like minor concerns in the face of economic and infrastructural necessities. But in fact, possessing one's records has many far-reaching implications. As I think is clear from my opening account of the grievances to King George and the subsequent rush to copying projects, the ownership of records is neither minor nor trivial. Ownership of records, or custody in archives language, not only speaks to legal issues, land claims, court proceedings, and vital statistics, but also engages moral and ethical concerns as well. In personal ways, records locate us, forming the substance of our memory as they affirm our identities. In a larger sense, records define the community as well. But as will be discussed later, both custody and records repatriation have wider societal implications. And what are the archival records? This presentation will suggest that in addition to those materials that we traditionally called records, societies, often post-colonial island societies, may express and document their heritage and cultures through a wide variety of tangible and intangible forms and formats. These dynamic expressions, the cultural archives of a community, may be the more important and meaningful records that a community creates. Using the Virgin Islands as a case study, I'd like to address these two larger questions of custody and the identity of the records themselves, since I believe that these questions hold answers to the smaller issues. I'd like to begin by setting a context and describing the case. Although this case is a little detailed, I feel that understanding the context is crucial, and I think make the parallels to islands on the other side of the world both obvious and clear. The United States Virgin Islands, located between the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, is at the top of an archipelago of an island chain that runs between the mainland United States and South America. It consists of three main islands, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. By the time Columbus discovered and named the island group in 1493, the indigenous Indian populations had all but disappeared. The few remaining Caribs were largely dispatched by Columbus and the Spaniards themselves. The islands were initially colonized by Denmark in the mid-1600s as part of the European land grab in the Caribbean to capitalize on the lucrative combination of Caribbean sugar plantations and the African slave trade. St. Thomas was colonized in the 1660s, with its sister islands of St. Croix and St. John brought into the Danish fold by the early 1700s. Together, they formed the Danish West Indies. Through an agreement with the Danish government, a chartered company, the Danish West India Company was the initial colonizer and governed the islands in these early years. St. Croix and St. John were primarily plantation economies, while St. Thomas, with its wide natural port and its location at the top of the chain, was a trading and commercial center. Economies on all three islands took full advantage of the very active African slave trade. By the late 18th century, the slave population of the Danish West Indies was over 32,000, while the white population was about 3,000. So, by far the majority of the enslaved population was on St. Croix. In 1833, the British Parliament passed an Emancipation Act, freeing the enslaved population in its own Caribbean colonies, but it was not until 1848, in a bloodless revolt, that the enslaved on St. Croix demanded and received freedom for themselves and those in the entire Danish West Indies. Of particular interest to archivists in this rebellion was the rebels' destruction of all the records in the St. Croix government offices, consisting of police, court, and criminal files. These were the files that symbolized colonial control, destroyed by the angry mob as they made their way to the Danish fort to confront the governor. Following emancipation and the end of free labor, the plantation economy on St. Croix went into decline, even though the newly freed received barely subsistent wages for working on the plantations. An agricultural revolt over low wages and poor working conditions, known as the Fire Burn in 1878, sealed the fate of the plantations. United States interest in acquiring the islands as strategic military bases began in the late 1800s, but it was not until 1917, after several abortive attempts, that the islands were sold to the United States for $25 million. They were officially transferred on March 31st, 1917, and renamed the United States Virgin Islands. Initially under the governance of the deeply racist U.S. Department of the Navy, the local residents of the Virgin Islands, primarily the descendants of the slaves, were placed in an ambiguous situation since they were not immediately granted American citizenship. After a decade of fighting for their rights, citizenship was finally granted in 1927, and the islands were transferred from the Navy to the U.S. Department of the Interior. Further fighting for self-government resulted in constitutional reforms in the 1950s and the right to elect their own governor in the 1960s. These efforts eventually resulted in a territory officially called a non-self-governing territory, and don't ask me what that means, that has control over its internal affairs, but is structurally administered within the U.S. Department of the Interior, as are all U.S. territories, and supported through a taxation system that returns federal income taxes to the territory. Although Virgin Islanders elect their own governor and legislature, they cannot vote in presidential elections and have a non-voting delegate to the U.S. Congress, whose major task is to protect the internal rights and ensure that the Virgin Islands is specifically included in national legislation. And so on to the records. As in most colonies, records were created in colonial offices in the mother country and were also locally created by colonial administrators within the colonies themselves. Danish colonial offices were established on all islands in the 17th and 18th century, and records were also created in plantations and commercial ventures as well by Danes, European planters, and businessmen. Few personal records were created by the enslaved, although many records were created about them. Although the majority of the records were written in Danish, and all government business was conducted in Danish, importantly, the Danes did not pass their language on to the slave population, who for the most part spoke English or Virgin Islands Dutch Creole. By the mid-19th century, colonial offices in the Danish West Indies became concerned about their local records, in addition to the tropical climate and the attendant insects and rodents, natural and political upheavals such as fires, hurricanes, and the Emancipation Rebellion itself put records at constant risk. And although records were kept, they were not very well kept and were generally in very deteriorating physical condition. Meanwhile, in Denmark, the Danish National Archives, formerly known as the Royal Archives, had been established in 1582 as a central repository for important documents to the state. But it was not until passage of the Archives Law of 1889 that all government archival institutions in Denmark were unified, and the official name of the Riksarkivet, Danish National Archives, was given to the central repository. In 1891, these new rules facilitated the transfer of records from government agencies and to the archives. Until these rules came into effect, nothing could have been transferred from the local Danish overseas possessions to the mother country. Regardless of the new regulations, however, colonial officials were reluctant to send their records to Denmark on the grounds that should they be needed, they could not easily be retrieved. But in spite of their prevarication, small but steady deliveries of pre-1848 records made their way to Denmark throughout the late 19th century in anticipation of an eventual sale. The convention between Denmark and the United States, transferring the Danish West Indies in 1916 specifically included stipulations for the disposition of records. So this is the treaty, and you can see that archives and records should be carefully preserved. Authenticated copies shall be at all times given to the shared around. However, none of this happened. Following the sale and the transfer to the Danish National Archivist, the Danish National Archives sent an archivist to the Virgin Islands to pack up the records that they felt rightfully belonged to Denmark. And they interpreted the treaty as only referring to property records. The United States Navy was then in charge of the islands. The records were, of course, in Danish. Having no interest in the records, and unable to read them anyway, the military government was only too happy to let the Danish archivist take as much as he could. In all, there are approximately 4,000 linear feet of West Indian archives in the Danish National Archives. Over half of these are the West Indian local archives, or records created in the colonies. Meanwhile, of course, the American government was busy creating records of its own. In 1936, the newly established National Archives of the United States, claiming the records created in the Virgin Islands as federal records, sent a Danish-speaking archivist to the Virgin Islands who scooped up records that the Danes had left behind and transferred those and records created by the administration to the National Archives. In spite of concerns and resistance by local Virgin Islands officials, the transferring of records continued until the early 1960s. Approximately 2,070 cubic feet of records were removed from the Virgin Islands to the U.S. National Archives. So far, this story has no happy ending, although there have been several attempts at patch-ups. Local records, as well as some leftover Danish ones, have remained in the Virgin Islands. Although efforts to construct a formal archives facility there have been sketchy and inconclusive, and although there's now a territorial archivist, there's no formal government records program and very inadequate storage. Over the past decade, efforts have been made to harmonize the Danish records between the three locations, but lack of resources and differing priorities have always been major obstacles. And so the records remain in three separate locations: Copenhagen, Washington, D.C., and the Virgin Islands, the majority inaccessible to Virgin Islanders. The loss of their records also became part of the collective memory of Virgin Islanders. Can you imagine, when the islands were sold to the United States, those old documents were taken to Denmark with the consent of the United States? It's as though the Danes sailed off with our history, our past. If you want to see those old original records, you must travel to Denmark and search through that country's historical archives. Issues of custody and repatriation reverberate throughout this case study, but at its heart, particularly for the records of the local Danish colonial government, is the question of to whom the records really belong to. Who has rightful ownership of the records? Is it the Danish harbor master who recorded the names or gave names to the slaves as they came off the ships? Or is it the slaves themselves whose existence created the need for the records? Is the colonial functionary or the colonial government the creator of the records, or do the subjects of the records, individuals who could not create records of their own, have some part in that creation? Does considering creation in a wider societal context suggest a more ambiguous ownership? Additionally, how much does the location of the records, where they were created, factor into this equation, both in terms of the provenance and the context? To draw from an example that I used last week at the ANU, at the Canberra, the Shaping Canberra conference, in my state of Massachusetts, a state law mandates that town records must remain in the towns in which they were created, no matter how old the records are or how old the town is. And some of them were founded in the 1600s. But these permanent records cannot be sent to the Central State Archives. All of the 351 towns, no matter their size, have a town clerk's office where these municipal records are maintained. Few of the towns have archives buildings, and still fewer have archivists. Town records may be kept in basements, in offices, in other buildings, or even in the town clerk's home. Despite continuing access and preservation hazards, however, each town has custody of its own records. Where the records were created trumps all other considerations. The state has determined that towns need their own records in order to govern effectively, and that townspeople need their own history in order to know their own heritage, their family continuity, and their roots. Having or not having custody of records has many implications beyond ownership. For example, in practical terms, not having custody of their records, in fact, having their records scattered in 3 different locations and not having access, has negatively impacted the Virgin Islands in several major ways. A series of interviews that I conducted with Virgin Islanders, as well as an extensive analysis of monographs and dissertations about the Virgin Islands, made some of the impacts, these negative impacts, very clear. Primarily among them is the ability of Virgin Islanders to write their own authoritative history. And while this speaks to a double lack of access to the records, both the geographical distance and the language issue may ultimately be more solvable than the one of distance, or of course both are factors. The majority of history books and dissertations on the US Virgin Islands, written by non-Danish speakers, both Virgin Islanders and others, use secondary sources for pre-1917 history, primarily relying on 1 or 2 English texts that actually did use sources from the Danish archives. Over several generations, it seems clear that the further history books are from the primary sources, the more anecdotal they have become, repeating unconfirmed observations, anecdotes, and hearsay without access to the supporting documentation. The one outstanding exception, a collection of essays by a Jamaican Danish-speaking historian who, working with the Danish archives, illustrates how history written from the perspective of the colonized, in this instance, a Caribbean person of African descent, transforms the narrative. Analyzing the slave society of the Danish West Indies by reading the colonizers' records against the grain reveals a startling different history than the one written by the colonizers. But ironically and tragically, this historian was killed in a car accident in the late 1980s, and no chronicler of his caliber has taken his place. A society without its records writes its own version of history, and people make choices about the history they want. In the face of lack of access to records and the resulting inadequate chronicling of their history and their culture, Virgin Islands discovered much of their history and their heritage through oral traditions and folk sources. Lack of access to written documentation, however, may become even more of a negative factor because oral traditions can be contradicted by the written word. When those with most stake in a tradition are unable to defend it because they cannot access primary sources, then oral tradition itself becomes vulnerable, a hostage to the unknown archives. In 1996, the Virgin Islands had its 150-year celebration of their emancipation in the Danish West Indies, as an example. A Danish historian presented a version of actual events of the slave rebellion that went contrary to the prevailing story. This scholar had mapped the hourly progress of the rebellion through examining Danish court records. His new version cast doubt upon the loyalty of the rebellion's folk hero, a former slave who led the revolt. These revelations made front-page news in the local newspaper, but were ultimately rejected by the populace, who opted to remain with their folk hero. Without local access to records, a newspaper editorial suggested, it was highly likely that reading those court records from a different perspective might have resulted in a different determination. But, the editorial concluded, the research behind these excellent and to many new presentations on slavery and emancipation in the Virgin Islands remain an exercise done by an elite of highly acclaimed scholars. And so while the written records and oral tradition can support one another, constructing a collective and cultural memory easily falls prey to the absence of records. Without the records of their heritage to anchor, confirm, and verify their memories, communities may be cast adrift and their traditions in doubt. But just because they opted for the folk hero over a record interpretation that raised doubts did not mean that Virgin Islanders reject their written records. Despite a strong inclination towards the oral tradition, Virgin Islanders recognize that while the written records of the colonizers primarily told only the master narratives of colonialism and enslavement, nonetheless they feel that their voices are in those records somewhere, even if only as whispers. And this need to find their own voices, the whispers in the records, has continued to drive their desire for custody of these records. Added to the ability to reinterpret and take ownership of colonial history is the ability to access family records, genealogy. This issue was brought forcibly and personally home to me, actually, only a few weeks ago, when trying to assist my sister-in-law trace the death certificate of a family patriarch who, relocating from Ireland in the mid-19th century, died in St. John in 1910. Using the online finding aid, or the inventory of the Danish West Indian records posted by the Danish National Archives several years ago, I found an intriguing-looking record group that might potentially contain a death certificate. But it turned out that only the finding aid and not the actual records are digitized. And so I have no access to the actual document from Boston. And this brings me to consider digitization, a possible but still problematic panacea for the custody question. The possibility of joint custody of colonial records by both the colonizer and the colonized was suggested in the 1980s by UNESCO and the International Council on Archives, and protocols for that process were recommended to the international community. The physical nature of the records, however, was always the obstacle. Today, digitization can make joint custody a reality, provided that the resources are available. In the case of the Danish records, the resources, for the most part, have not been available, but other former colonial countries have gone much further in sharing their records virtually. Even so, it's an expensive and complex proposition that at best provides only a partial solution to the custody issue. Despite virtual solutions, the question of repatriation of physical documents remains. A digital record, by definition, lacks the crucial physical qualities of the original, the power of the real thing, or what archivists call intrinsic value. While digitization expands potentials, the value of the container and its relation to both contents and contexts remain essential elements in our personal connections to archives. Tourists lining up at the rotunda to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to glimpse the original Declaration of Independence and the Constitution know already what these documents say. The texts are readily available. But it is the original that carries the emotional weight, connecting us to our history in a very personal way. Across the centuries, we are sharing something with those signers, those founding fathers. Despite their sophisticated use of the latest social media, my archive students feel exactly the same way. They are bowled over when they come face to face with an original letter written by John Kennedy or John Adams in one of our libraries in Boston. The emotional and personal power of these physical pieces of paper, the way the paper curls slightly, increases its thickness or thinness, the rough or smooth edges of the sheet, the color and density of the ink, is difficult to quantify, but potent nevertheless. Some of these physical qualities of the paper and the writings can be captured digitally, but not all. And what may be most difficult to capture is that emotional kinship that links us to the writer. Imagine seeing your own ancestor's signature on a document, even if that signature might be only a first name, a surname, or an X. Joint custody through digitization and repatriation, then, are not quite the same thing. But it also seems to me that this emotional, historical, and memory-building arena, not all documents are equal either. Joint custody could also mean shared ownership of records in a variety of formats. For example, while the digitized records could be equally accessible to both colonizer and former colony, some physical records, such as the administrative ones of colonial offices, might more appropriately remain with the colonizer, while others, particularly those containing genealogical information, might belong better in the former colony, near the people they are about and where they were created, in spite of hurricanes, cyclones, and tropical weather. Perhaps in this way, with both joint custody and joint responsibility, both the emotional and the informational power and potential of colonial records could be fully realized. Joint custody also suggests some approaches to ethical access, particularly in cases of culturally sensitive information. Who has the right to use the records, and who has the right to restrict their use? Are there paths to joint solutions? Questions around the ethical use of records are an increasing concern in the United States, as Native Americans assert their right to control their own archival information, records created about them, as well as records created by them. What happens, for example, when the open archival collection of an early 20th century anthropologist contains images that violate the privacy of a contemporary indigenous community? And of course, questions over culturally sensitive material are not confined to indigenous groups, but apply equally to records from a wide variety of communities. Colonial records, or the oral as well as the written records of marginalized ethnic populations or immigrant groups, might all potentially contain materials with disputed and contested claims that require reasoned and fair ethical decisions based on cultural sensitivity as well as sound archival practice. Increasingly, protocols written by communities such as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander protocols are grappling with this concern. Joint custody then could also mean partnerships and mutual agreements. Finally, I'd like to address that second question posed at the beginning of this presentation. What are the records? A question that speaks directly to the many conflicting claims on records discussed above. In addition to colonial records, Are there other sources, different kinds of archives, by which a community builds its collective memory and fashions its identity? While the colonial records are historically important, there are other records created by local populations that are equally, if not more crucial to the community, more evocative of the traditions and cultures, records that look forwards instead of backwards. While scholars in many disciplines have long recognized connections between cultural expressions, records, and community heritage, little attempt has really been made by archivists to treat these expressions as mainstream archives. But in all cultures, certain objects, activities, and performances tell stories, embody meanings, and represent traces that relate specifically to the ways that the culture understands itself. Don't those records also belong in the archives? An archives conference held in Perth in 2008 by a group called ICORA specifically addressed questions of indigenous and post-colonial records, records from the margins rather than the mainstream. Wampum belts among First Nations, tribes in Canada, First Nations wampum museum burials in Cape Town, tattoos in the Pacific Islands, rock art among the Aborigines of Northern Australia, canoes in Fiji, carnival celebrations in the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean were all examples of records, cultural traces that told stories, evidenced actions, marked identities. The conference reimagined archives that, rather than supporting the major narratives of colonialism, supported the minor narratives of the people, and alternative archives that related intimately to the culture, identity, and collective memory of specific community. This reimagining supports the directions that academic scholarship is taking in this postmodern, post-colonial environment, where both memory and history similarly work towards understanding societies. Today, it's the minor narratives, the untold stories, the traces, the whispers, and the expressions of marginalized identities that people and communities yearn to find in the archives. Their success may depend on the availability of the evidence, but their success may also depend on the ability of archivists to recognize and accept this evidence into the archives. If the archives is to be a place where all stories can be found, then archivists and those supporting archives must expand their horizons to embrace a larger and more inclusive vision of the records that communities create. Events such as performances, parades, celebrations, and commemorations, while generally recognized as expressions of cultural values, can also be thought of as archival evidence, or even as records themselves. Memorials, customs, folk traditions, and folk tales all have a place in the archives if they contribute to our understanding of the creators. And this digital age offers the perfect vehicles for presenting these dynamic and ever-evolving records. And so, in conclusion, let me point out that our virtual environment, our digital era, offers the potential for historians, archivists, and other cultural and heritage workers to deeply engage with post-colonial archival issues in creative and innovative ways. Digitizing, copying, and even repatriating collections, sharing information virtually, dynamically presenting and preserving cultural expressions through a variety of web possibilities are some of the activities that might help to resolve post-colonial records dilemmas. And nowhere is this online environment more potent and full of possibilities than in the area of education, specifically archival education. Recently, I was part of a team of archivists and educators advising UNESCO and the Library School at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica on creating a curriculum for a Master's of Archival Science. Over 2 intense days, the group quickly determined that this degree needed to be fully online in order to be accessible to all individuals on small islands who otherwise might be unable to attend face-to-face classes. Most importantly, we constructed a curriculum designed to specifically address the archival concerns of small tropical island populations. Topics such as tropical preservation, management in small economies, archiving oral traditions. In addition to some of the concerns I have raised in this paper, we're woven into standard archival subjects, such as appraisal and access. Clearly, the best solution for post-colonial archives is the development of post-colonial archivists. In order to achieve that, archivists, both those on the mainland and those in the islands, must be willing to accommodate and set aside when necessary formal notions of traditional records, must be willing to give up as well as to acquire, and must be willing to embrace the many diverse cultural ways in which communities express themselves, understand their histories, and construct their collective memories. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this talk. It was very interesting. It agrees just about everything you said. But I have a little story and a question about a different side of the colonial archives, because colonial archives are not pretty to the formerly colonized people. They very often must they're very confronting. And in 2005, when my colleague here, Ewan Maitland, over there, and I did some research and spoke about photographs of Pacific Islanders in Australian collections, he did have a look, and your book was an inspiration. And Terry Cook's writing, and yours as well, on shared provenance and custody and legal ownership and moral ownership. So all these questions are very important. But we also touched upon the David Hanlon's idea of the chill of the archives. And I actually experienced myself a similar, basically the chill of the archives. My great-grandfather disappeared during the Second World War. And by 2007, the German archives had been digitized, and there was a central database where you could put the name of a person and see if they were in concentration camps. I'm not into family history, I was not interested, I was just curious. I said, I'll just type in the name, and I did. And then this card, this German card, came into my face, and the effect was physical. And even now, as I'm talking, it's 5 years now, it's the physical effect that seeing this bureaucratic card. I'm an archivist, so I have nothing against bureaucracy, nothing against cards, but seeing this confronting, this digitized image, basically, the family never knew what happened to the person, to my great-grandfather. In 4 weeks after he was taken to be sold, he's disappeared, and for decades the government said, don't know. So I was the first person, about 60 years later, looking at this and seeing this, never thought of this person, never felt anything. I was physically shaking, I was sweating, I don't know, all sorts of things. So, and in the ways you were talking about custody, I was thinking now, I didn't want this physical object. I so detest just the whole existence of it. So in a way, maybe, as you said, there's certain archives maybe do not need to come and be repatriated. But I'm interested if you had any stories about Virgin Islanders, if they've had similar stories. There's this physical demonstration on this chill of the archives. I never believed in it. I thought it was just great art. It's just information. And look at me now, I'm almost cynical of them all, just almost not shaking again.
That's really a fascinating story of why you wouldn't want to have the records. And I suppose it's possible that once you sort of recover from that first physical shock, you may want to have it even as a terrible and negative. Maybe it's better to have knowledge than not to have the knowledge.
Probably.
Yeah, so and I think I think of, you know, how, for example, a Virgin Islander going to Denmark, confronting possibly records of their ancestors' enslavement, might have that same physical shock. And I really couldn't judge whether that it's good to have that shock or not to have that shock. I suppose it's for each individual to really decide.
I guess it would be similar at the society level too.
Yes, exactly.
One piece of document, what about the mass, how the whole society was used and abused?
Yes, but I think that, you know, as I said, there are many Virgin Islanders who have lobbied for a long, long time to have some of these records come back. I mean, they realize that these are not friendly records, and yet there's always that hope that there is something of them in there, and if these were read by them, they would see things, and they would see themselves somewhere. So maybe sometimes it's more important to see yourself, even though it might not be a pleasant experience. I don't know if that's an answer.
One question just here and then one up there.
Looking at the two terms as used, archives and records, they're rather hard sort of terms, all-encompassing, and bearing in mind that history is written by the victors. Where are we in relation to the translation, and in what form do the records and the archives take? Do they translate into the language of the victor, and in the process, do we lose the finesse and the feeling which actually goes with the original telling? And how do we try to eliminate the superimposition of the culture and the values of the person who is actually performing the translation, which subsequently ends up in the record?
I think that's really a great point. And, you know, not something that I would have an answer to, but certainly I think it's really important to consider that. When I worked many, many years ago at the Virgin Islands Public Libraries, we had hired a Danish person to do the translations of the documents. Now, again, you know, maybe we would have had to know a lot about his psychology to screen out, to know how he was doing the translations. But it was as close as we could get to helping people who brought records in, or when we sent away to get records from Denmark, which they charged us for, by the way. And so I'm not quite sure how you ever resolve that translation issue. I think it occurs in all kinds of situations. I suppose the solution is to learn the language yourself, but even then, you know, what's the lens that you're reading it through? And I suppose archivists believe that there used to be a conception that archives were the truth, and that conception disappeared several decades ago. And now I think archivists and historians and others all realize that records and archives are never neutral. And that sort of has to be taken into account. And so maybe when you are reading something, all of those layers that you mentioned always have to be factored in.
Question here and then another over there. So you might
links both those questions. Going back to I'm wondering whether, particularly in the digital age and websites that declare an archive to the to the world, and the various subcomponents of their archive, is it possible to create an educative interface which allows for the voices of the potential users or explorers, just typical examples of that helps. You've got a dialogue not just between the institutions saying this is what we have, right, but people who've used it saying this is the way in which I've used it. And if you've got a little small section in your website that's like that, it allows for the possibility of a viewer to the possibility that this might create. The experience is not necessarily going to be individual.
Yes, I see what you mean.
It's not just the curator or the archivist
Yeah.
or the specialist historian who's saying this is the nature of the content, but the user also accounting for it.
I think that's a really interesting idea as kind of a crowdsourcing, where people would comment on records. I think that archivists themselves would feel that their job is to present, recognizing this business about neutrality, but at least to present the record in as objective a state as possible, and that it's for the users, the historians, and the researchers to do the interpretations. But this kind of site you're suggesting, I think that actually, I know of sites that may not have necessarily controversial records, but have, for example, different records that people might relate to or add to or have heard about, where this kind of crowdsourcing is going on. And so I think that is increasingly something that is going on websites.
Yeah, I'm thinking more at the main entry point to the institutional record, the institution itself. The equivalency of when you sometimes have to go on and have a disclaimer. You sign on and say, I'm entering this under an understanding, ... You know what I mean? Part of that kind of initial entrance to the thing says, look, this is not necessarily
A pleasant place to be.
what
Yeah.
you might think about the various.
I think that might for archivists, that might be going a little too far beyond neutrality to do something like that. But but it's an interesting idea. You had a question too.
Thank you very much. I was interested in the whole concept of records in this post-colonial setting. When you're talking about colonial records, they have a certain materiality and historical provenance. But when you're talking about the minor narratives of the people and cultural traces, and you alluded to oral histories, oral testimonies, and to material objects, which
Yeah.
is the water and so on. Now, in a larger society, like Australia, we have an oral history collection at the library, and we have a collection of indigenous material artifacts at the museum.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have records, colonial and post-colonial, at the archive.
Yeah.
Now, part of my question is, is there a museum and is there a library in the Virgin Islands? But more importantly, each of those types of institutions, have different protocols. They have different understandings of what it is that they are collecting and what it is that they're doing with them once they're collected, which can create some sense of property boundaries and a bit of concern about who owns what at an institutional level, let alone at the level of the people whose cultural artifacts these actually are.
I think that is a really complicated question, and certainly, reflects the reality that, you have museums and they collect in a certain way with a certain purpose, and libraries likewise, and archives likewise. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that all of these things be combined. I guess what I'm really suggesting is reading some of those cultural, if you want to call them artifacts, in a different kind, reading them more as texts than as artifacts. Reading some of the sort of these various cultural expressions as evidence and telling us about the culture itself, that these are the records in a sense. It's sort of, kind of a concept of a cultural archive. And I think that, and I do think that in various interpretations, and that archivists and libraries and museums to some extent try to do that in different ways, but I think it hasn't gotten sorted out into one way.
We've just got one last question for you, Jeannette. Over here.
just wanted to compare the experience in the Caribbean with the position in the Pacific, where amongst the new nations there are well-established archives. Some, for example, in Fiji, as old as any in Australia, having been established in the 1950s. And most other countries also have got control of parts of their colonial records and perhaps less control of their records of the new nation. And you touched on a question of training for a post-colonial archivist and a digital context for that training. The USP did undertake systematically library training in precisely the way you described, University of South Pacific, based in Fiji, but was not able to come across to requests from PARPICA, the regional branch of the International Council on Archives, to establish an equivalent program for archivists. So from two directions, we are coming across a weak spot in post-colonial societies where in some cases it has been difficult to staff established archives by a second generation of archivists.
Yeah. Yes. No. I realize this is a real issue, and this whole UNESCO thing to create an archives curriculum came from exactly that problem. So that you have all these new nations and new islands. There are some well-established archives in the Caribbean, but then there's lots of small islands that don't have lots of archivists, don't have training opportunities and so forth. And so currently, if you live in the Caribbean and you want to be an archivist, you have to go to the United Kingdom or you have to go to Canada. And it might be the same that people in the Pacific have to come to Australia or so forth. But the archivists there are very, and it's CARBICA in the Caribbean, PARBICA in the Pacific. They're very passionate about wanting to be able to have this education themselves and to want to be able to train and educate their own people for their own things. And this whole business of recognizing how cultural various aspects of archives were kind of evolved as we talked more and more, and we saw what was really unique about islands and island cultures that were directly related, that really related so much to thinking about and interpreting archival practices in different ways. So developing your own, growing your own is always the best.
Well, we've had a treat, haven't we? A talk that begins with a congressional statement and then we the people. I think the 12th annual lecture has established a new standard, and I think the first international lecturer. Jeannette was the 5th Jenkinson lecturer earlier this year in London at the University College London, and we, like they, are so lucky to have had her here as our lecturer. Speaking personally for a moment, it's been wonderful to get to know this week Jeannette and Cal, the photographer up there, and to learn a little bit about the person behind this wonderful text, Owning Memory. I'm sorry if I'm going to embarrass Jeannette now, but anyone who survives a Category 5 hurricane, as she and Cal did in 1989 when Hurricane Hugo swept through the Virgin Islands, 90% of homes wiped out. You're all up then as our game now, Jeannette. A talk that had so much, so challenging, so relevant when you look at the comparisons of the issues we face in Australia and in the Pacific with the Virgin Islands. Traditionally, I've been watching the role of the President of the Friends of the Buckland for a little while, and they basically give a very short thanks. So I think I should just do so now with a token, and I'm going to break with tradition. I know you will all approve that we are giving Jeannette a copy of Bill Gamage's The Greatest Estate. So please join with me in thanking our 12th Buckland lecturer.